Good morning. Bishop Goodpastor, Reverend Ingram, clergy, fellow lay delegates, friends and family, I'm very grateful to the Board of Laity for giving me this opportunity to share a few words with you this morning. I'm also very grateful for all the laity in our conference and the ways that they work unceasingly to make our communities and churches better. Hear now these very familiar words from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, verses 31 through 40, as written in the Message. When he finally arrives, blazing in beauty, and all his angels around him, the Son of Man will take his place on his glorious throne. Then all the nations will be arranged before him, and he will sort the people out, much as a shepherd sorts out sheep and goats, putting the sheep to his right and the goats to his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Enter, you who are blessed by my Father. Take what's coming to you. It's been ready for you since the world's foundation. And here's why. I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was homeless, and you gave me a room. I was shivering, and you gave me clothes. I was sick, and you stopped to visit. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then those sheep are going to say, "Master, what are you talking about? When did we ever see you hungry and feed you, thirsty and give you a drink? And when did we ever see you sick or in prison and come to you?" The king will say, "I'm telling the solemn truth. Whenever you did one of these things to someone overlooked or ignored, that was me. You did it to me." It was January of 1987, and my family had just moved to a new house about 30 minutes from where we had previously lived in Maryland. As a 7th grader, I had to transfer from Magathie River Middle School to Severna Park Middle School in the middle of the year. Talk about torture. I had known my classmates for years, I had a great group of friends, and I knew immediately that this transition would not be easy. At the time, I had never worried much about what clothes I wore or what kind of car my parents drove. Material things just weren't important. But when my guidance counselor took me on a tour of my new school just before Christmas break, I quickly noticed that everyone was wearing those very cool Outback red 10-button shirts from the Limited and Benetton rugby shirts. It seemed as though everyone had perfect clothes and perfect shoes and perfect hair. I quickly became aware of what I did not have, as my worries about fitting in started to escalate. The dreaded first day of school came, and I made it through homeroom and my first few classes before the lunch hour arrived. Now, the lunchroom at a middle school can be a place of sheer terror, even for people that have been there for years. I walked into the cafeteria, and I looked around. Where was I supposed to sit? There were a few empty tables in the center. You remember those institutional rectile tangles with the picnic-style benches? So I sat down at an empty table. Conspicuous, alone, overlooked, ignored. Just as I was opening my lunch bag, a girl that I didn't recognize from any of my classes walked by and said, "Hey, I'm Laura. Are you new here? Why don't you come sit with us?" Wow, an invitation, a chance to make some friends. I was incredibly grateful. I sat down and was introduced to a whole group of people. They were discussing an upcoming youth retreat. Laura turned to me and said, "You know what? You should come to my church. We have an awesome youth group. You would love it." And that was just the beginning of the rest of my life. That Sunday evening, I walked into Severna Park United Methodist, UMYF, for the very first time. When I walked in the door, Laura immediately saw me and called me over. She introduced me to fellow 7th graders, as well as some high school juniors and seniors who seemed genuinely happy to meet me and made me feel welcome. Everyone kept talking about these youth retreats. They were legendary, and they still are today. Severna Park UMC is blessed to have Reverend Lee Farrell, minister of Christian education and youth, who has now been there for 38 years. Lee has created an environment where youth are welcomed and feel included and loved, and they can't wait to be at church. This is the place where youth are eager to participate in Disciple Bible Study and the Appalachian Service Project, and they literally count the days until they're old enough to sign up. I credit Laura for inviting me and Lee for ministering to me. Without them, I would not have had the life journey that has brought me here. The nurturing, spiritual growth, the education, the discipline, that is how my faith grew. That is how my life was transformed. I was a 7th grader who was alone and scared, and then I was invited, welcomed, included, and loved. Invited, welcomed, included, and loved. Have you ever felt like I did on that January day in the lunchroom? Alone, conspicuous, overlooked, ignored? Maybe you were bullied as an adolescent. Maybe you suffered abuse at home. Perhaps you've struggled with an addiction, anxiety, depression. Perhaps you made some poor decisions and did something that you regretted, something that hurt another person. Maybe you were newly divorced and felt isolated. Or maybe you just came out of the closet only to find that your church says you're incompatible with Christian teaching. Alone, conspicuous, overlooked, ignored. These feelings need to be transformed into invited, welcomed, included, and loved. Remember the sheep and the goats? Have we welcomed the stranger? Remember the woman at the well, the leper, the widow? Jesus gives us the ultimate model for how we are called to interact with each of these people. The least, the last, the outcast, the marginalized. Our conference is working on transforming lives, churches, and communities. We cannot transform anything until our churches become places where people are invited, welcomed, included, and loved. We are working toward that in the United Methodist Church, but we're not quite there yet. A few years ago, Josh and I were visiting another church in our conference, and we sat in about the 4th pew, and there was nobody seated anywhere around us. And a woman walked up and said, "Excuse me, you're in my seat." I turned to her and smiled and said, "I'm sorry, I thought this was a church. I didn't know you had assigned seats." And we proceeded to move on down the row. Luckily, this wonderfully warm welcome from this particular woman didn't faze me. But what if it had taken me weeks to work up the courage to walk through those doors? What if I had never been exposed to a church or to Christianity? Would I have felt welcomed, let alone like I belonged? Would I have come back? The thing is, this woman had no clue that her words could have caused hurt or anger. First impressions make a world of difference. It doesn't stop with first impressions. Sometimes we invite, and sometimes we even get good at welcoming. If we want to transform lives, we must start with inviting and welcoming, but we can't stop there. We must also help others to feel included, and then we must love them, every single one of them, just like Jesus did. The leper, the outcast, the drug addict, the widow. How will we ever transform our communities if people see the church as exclusive or as a place where they cannot be loved? Jean Vanier, the founder of the L'Arche communities, told the following story about persevering in our practice of unconditional love. "I know a man who lives in Paris. His wife has Alzheimer's. He was an important businessman. his life filled with busyness. But he said that when his wife fell sick, I just couldn't put her in an institution. So I kept her, fed her, and bathed her. I went to Paris to visit them, and this businessman who had been very busy all his life said, "I've changed. I have become more human." I got a letter from him recently. He said in the middle of the night, his wife woke him up. She came out of her fog for a moment and said, "Darling, I just want to thank you for all that you're doing." Then she fell back into her fog. He told me I wept and I wept. Vanier says, sometimes Christ calls us to love people who cannot love us in return. They live in the fog of mental illness, disabilities, poverty, or spiritual blindness. As we serve them, we may only receive fleeting glimpses of gratitude. But just as Jesus has loved us in the midst of our spiritual confusion, so we continue to love others as they walk through a deep fog. We are called to love others, to love everyone. Some of those folks will love us back and contribute to our mission to transform the world, and others may not be able. Jesus calls us to love them regardless. I have no doubt in my mind that if we truly become a church with open hearts, open minds, and open doors like we say we are, we will be empowered to transform many lives and many communities. We have a long way to go until we include every single person, young and old, rich and poor, liberal and conservative, housed and unhoused, gay and straight, those filled with faith and those filled with doubt, documented and undocumented. Until then, transformation is out of reach. Until we include everyone, just as Jesus calls us. Laura and I are still very close friends 25 years later. And I was in Maryland for her mother's funeral this past fall. And I reminded her of that day in 7th grade when she invited me to sit with her at lunch and invited me to her church. And she said, "I don't even remember that day." You see, our actions and our words might seem insignificant to us, but they can be life-changing for someone else. Our actions and words and spirit can be transformative. We all need to be like my friend Laura. Our churches need to be like my friend Laura. Invite, but don't stop there. Welcome, but don't stop there either. Include, and don't stop there. Love. Because as Jesus says, whenever you did one of these things to someone overlooked or ignored, that was me. You did it to me.